Jerry stared in disbelief as the bank teller sneered, mocking his decades-old checkbook like it was a museum relic. Then, without warning, his entire life savings, millions wired through that useless account, was frozen, trapping him in a nightmare he didn't understand. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. Jerry Parker stood rigid for a moment, the line to the teller behind him growing longer, but he didn't move. His mind raced, struggling to bridge two worlds, the one where a young banker sneered at his faded checkbook, and this new, unimaginable reality where his quiet life was suddenly entangled with the Pentagon's clandestine dealings. That checkbook, which Brad Collins had so easily dismissed, now felt like a relic wrapped in mystery, a thread linking Jerry to something far beyond his small-town routine. Jerry's eyes scanned the worn pages of that checkbook in his hand. Each scribbled transaction represented years of simple living, steady paychecks from his military pension, occasional Social Security deposits, careful savings tucked away for emergencies. It wasn't just a ledger, it was his story, one built on decades of discipline, sacrifice, and an unyielding sense of honor. He never bothered with flashy apps or electronic transfers. Why would he? He had trusted that old checkbook like an old friend, reliable and honest. Now, it was the focal point of a conspiracy he barely understood. Inside the bank, Brad's earlier laughter echoed bitterly in Jerry's ears. That smug smirk, the dismissive tone, the way he'd casually made Jerry feel obsolete, like a relic nobody wanted to deal with anymore. Jerry had seen that attitude before, the subtle contempt that people showed vets or anyone who didn't keep up with the latest trends. But this time, it cut deeper. Brad wasn't just mocking a checkbook. He was mocking Jerry's entire life, his principles, the discipline forged through years of service. Jerry's jaw tightened. He thought about all the nights spent overseas, the battles fought, the friends lost, and the promises made to himself to keep things straightforward back home. His old-fashioned ways weren't a weakness. They were a shield against chaos, a way to preserve control. Yet, here he was, powerless, stuck behind a frozen bank account that suddenly had millions of dollars flowing through it, millions he wasn't even sure he was supposed to touch. The phone call replayed in his head, Lieutenant Daniel's voice steady but urgent. "Classified operation. Immediate freeze." The words felt cold, impersonal, like a command from a faceless bureaucracy that had pulled Jerry's life into a game he never asked to play. He'd always been a man of action, accustomed to clear missions and known enemies. But this was shadowy, confusing, and terrifying. His private life, his hard-earned security, was now hostage to an invisible war fought in offices far beyond his reach. Jerry clenched his fists, feeling the weight of the invisible hand that had hijacked his account. It wasn't just about money, it was about trust, respect, and dignity. His bank, his longtime financial home, had shut him out without explanation, leaving him stranded in uncertainty. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same institution that scoffed at his checkbook was now wielding its power to isolate him, to keep him in the dark. As the line behind him shifted, Jerry finally stepped away from the counter, folding the worn checkbook carefully into his jacket pocket. He knew this was just the beginning of something far bigger than a simple banking error or a moment of youthful mockery. Somewhere beneath the layers of secrecy and bureaucracy, there was a story tied to that faded book, one that Jerry was determined to uncover, no matter the cost. The weight of injustice settled heavily on his shoulders, but beneath it, a flicker of resolve ignited. Jerry wasn't just a man with an old checkbook. He was a veteran who had faced adversity before, and he would face it again. This time, the stakes were higher, and the enemy more elusive, but his spirit was far from broken. The aftermath of the account freeze hit Jerry Parker like a relentless storm, eroding every semblance of normalcy he had left. Each morning, he awoke with a heavy knot in his stomach, knowing that his access to life's essentials, his pension, his savings, the quiet security of decades, was locked behind impenetrable walls of red tape and cold protocol. The bank, once a mundane pit stop in his daily routine, had transformed into a fortress of indifference and bureaucratic stonewalling. Jerry's attempts to pierce that wall were met with frustration and frustration alone. Phone calls to the bank's customer service were exercises in futility. Automated voices churned through scripted options, none leading anywhere useful. When he did manage to speak with a representative, their words were rehearsed, deliberately vague, and carefully crafted to avoid any commitment or clarity. "We're looking into it," they said. "Please allow additional time for review." Days blurred into a fog of waiting, each moment amplifying the sting of powerlessness. The secrecy demanded by the Pentagon strangled Jerry's ability to advocate for himself. The classified nature of the funds wired into his account was a double-edged sword. While it suggested significance beyond his ordinary life, it also shackled him with silence. He couldn't disclose details without risking grave consequences, and so his protests were muffled, dismissed as irrational or uninformed. The very institution that once honored his service now treated him like an enigma to be contained, a risk to be managed. And then there was Brad Collins, the young banker whose mockery had ignited the spark of Jerry's indignation. Brad's condescension persisted, a quiet but persistent jab every time Jerry crossed the threshold of the bank. His smirks and veiled sneers communicated a dismissiveness that pierced deeper than any outright insult. Brad embodied the institutional attitude Jerry was fighting against: youthful arrogance, cloaked in ignorance, an embodiment of the broader societal tendency to overlook, to diminish, to forget the sacrifices of men like Jerry. With every interaction, the pain of injustice carved deeper into Jerry's spirit. He felt the weight of being reduced from a proud veteran to a suspicious anomaly, from a respected citizen to a subject of institutional paranoia. The irony was suffocating. He had fought wars, endured hardships, and navigated perilous landscapes abroad. Yet the fiercest battle now was against the cold indifference of bureaucracies at home. But beneath the pain, a steely resolve began to crystallize. Jerry was not merely fighting for access to frozen funds. He was demanding recognition, fairness, and respect. His fight was emblematic, a stand for all veterans marginalized by systems too large and too impersonal to care. This was about dignity, about reclaiming a place in a society that often turned its back on those who served. Jerry began to meticulously document every interaction, each call, every visit, the tone of every conversation. He compiled emails, recorded names, and jotted down dates with methodical precision. He reached out to veteran organizations, sharing his story with groups who understood the unspoken battles fought beyond the battlefield. He contacted local journalists, crafting a narrative that highlighted not only his personal struggle, but the broader failure of institutions to honor their obligations to veterans. The story of the faded checkbook, the frozen millions, and the faceless bureaucracy began to ripple beyond his immediate circle. Public sympathy grew, fueled by a collective sense of injustice. People resonated with Jerry's quiet dignity in the face of overwhelming odds. Social media posts shared his plight, veteran forums buzzed with discussions, local news anchors debated the ethics of a government so secretive that it could weaponize a man's financial security without accountability. Meanwhile, inside the bank, Brad's bravado dimmed as the spotlight shifted. His once smug attitude transformed into unease as the institution's legal team rallied to defend the freeze. Their official stance was unwavering. National security demanded the restrictions, and no civilian inquiry could override classified orders. Brad found himself caught in a web spun by forces far beyond his youthful arrogance. Jerry remained the fulcrum of this unfolding drama, a lone figure buffeted by the might of impersonal powers. He endured the silence, the mockery, and the isolation with a growing fire beneath his calm exterior. The injustice was real, sharp, and suffocating. But within that pain burned an unyielding determination. Jerry Parker was not done. not by a long shot. When the tide finally shifted, it did so with a quiet but resolute force that no amount of institutional inertia could withstand. Jerry Parker's fight, once teetering on the brink of exhaustion, found new breath as veteran advocacy groups mobilized with relentless precision. These organizations, forged from the shared experience of service and struggle, recognized Jerry's plight not just as an isolated incident, but as a glaring symptom of a systemic failure, one that betrayed the very men and women who had stood at the nation's front lines. Their intervention turned the spotlight onto the Pentagon and the bank, challenging the absurdity of freezing an entire lifetime's savings without explanation, transparency, or compassion. Under the mounting pressure of public scrutiny, the Pentagon broke its silence, revealing just enough to clarify the situation without compromising national security. The millions wired through Jerry's account were indeed tied to a covert operation, but Jerry himself was no suspect, no criminal. He was, in fact, a trusted conduit, an unwitting guardian of sensitive funds entrusted to him by the government precisely because of his integrity and reliability. The narrative of suspicion and injustice unraveled with each carefully worded statement, dismantling the assumptions that had shackled Jerry's access and sullied his reputation. With the Pentagon's reluctant acknowledgement came the bank's begrudging compliance. The freeze was lifted, layers of security and restrictions peeled back to reveal the account's true status. Jerry, who had lived through the cold silence of exclusion, finally regained full access to the funds that were rightfully his. The relief was profound but tempered. What had been stolen from him was more than money. It was dignity, trust, the quiet assurance of control over his own life. The story, however, extended beyond the mere restoration of financial access. Brad Collins, the young banker whose sneers had once seemed so inconsequential, found himself repositioned, not just physically behind a desk in customer service training, but mentally confronted with the consequences of his ignorance. The bank, compelled by the swirling public backlash, forced Brad into a program designed to instill empathy and awareness, to bridge the yawning gap between youthful arrogance and the lived realities of veterans like Jerry. The once dismissive smiles gave way to forced reflection, a small but necessary reckoning with the human cost of condescension. Meanwhile, Jerry's voice, once muffled by secrecy and silence, emerged as a beacon within the veteran community and beyond. Invitations poured in for him to speak at support events, rallies, and forums, places where his story became more than personal testimony. It became a rallying cry, each recounting of his journey marked by mockery, bureaucratic labyrinths, and ultimate vindication served as an emblem of resilience and dignity. His steadfastness transformed him from a forgotten retiree into a symbol of quiet triumph, a reminder that respect is not a privilege but a right owed to every veteran. The faded checkbook that Brad Collins had mocked so openly was no longer just a relic of an outdated era. It had become a symbol of endurance, a testament to the unyielding spirit that defines those who have served. In a world quick to discard the past and those who carry its burdens, Jerry's journey illuminated a simple truth. No amount of scorn or institutional neglect can break the spirit forged by sacrifice and honor. In this hard-won victory, Jerry Parker did more than reclaim his frozen account. He reclaimed a narrative too often denied to veterans, a narrative of respect, justice, and unwavering hope. His story inspired not only those who had walked similar paths, but everyone who believed in the fundamental decency that must underpin a society's treatment of its heroes. The triumph was not merely financial, it was profoundly human, a beacon lighting the way from injustice to redemption.